1 year ago, I owned 0 Sony cameras, and now I own 3. After using Canon for 15 years, I really wanted to stay with the system that I was already super familiar with, but with Sony reasons to switch, I can't have held out forever. And if you're someone who watches a lot of camera-related videos, you've probably seen the I'm switching video several times. So instead of just making a like Canon bad, Sony good video, I want to give you some insight into the actual thought process, the reasoning behind my decision, and maybe that will be helpful for you. Before doing that though, very important to point out that for the past few years, it's been almost impossible to buy a bad camera, as long as you're getting a camera from like any of the main brands. If you're getting some weird off-market thing that no one's ever heard of, it might be terrible. But if you're getting a Canon, a Sony, a Panasonic, a Fuji, a Nikon, whatever, they're all great. They all have different strengths and weaknesses, but there's a lot of really good stuff out there. So if you've got a Canon camera and you love it, that's awesome. You should keep loving it and keep using it. My problem though was that my workflow and my needs were evolving in a way that Canon just wasn't able to keep up with. It wasn't able to give me what I needed anymore. So let's talk about the EOS R, because this is arguably the best Canon camera I ever had. My very first Canon was an XTI in 2007. Then in 2010, I got the T2i, which was great to my eyes because it was the first DSLR I owned that shot video. And that was obviously a pretty big game changer. In 2013, I got the 60D. In 2015, I got the 6D, which is what I had when I started my YouTube channel. In 2017, I got the 6D Mark II, which my wife actually still uses on her YouTube channel. And in 2019, I got the EOS R. And in 2020, I actually got a second EOS R, so I had 2 of them. And throughout that time, I was working as a digital media teacher where I built up 2 different digital media programs at 2 different schools, kind of all based around Canon. So I think I must have ordered and helped supply like over 100 different Canon bodies, probably 200 different Canon lenses. So I've used a lot of Canon cameras. I'm pretty familiar with Canon. I think they make great cameras. I absolutely love their lenses. But when it comes to finding the right camera for you, it's all about you. You know, like you get to be super selfish and decide what your needs are. When I got the EOS R, which is still an unbelievably great camera, and I still think a really good value, especially if you're working mainly in a 1080 workflow and not a 4K workflow. But when I got the EOS R, it was my first mirrorless camera. It had the best autofocus that I've ever used. It had the best image quality that I've ever gotten. It's a great stills camera, and it is rock solid reliable. I use this for so many videos and photos and professional things and personal things. And when I was teaching, especially in the early part of the pandemic, where for over a year I was doing all my classes online, this was the camera I used to run all of my classes. So it was just on all day, every day. And then after that, I would use it for, you know, my own personal meetings and consultations and all this kind of stuff. So the amount of hours that I put on this camera is almost absurd, and it has never failed me. It's a really, really good camera. But over time, my workflow evolved in a way that the camera just wasn't really keeping up with. When I first got the R, I didn't care about a 4K workflow. I didn't even have a computer that could really edit in 4K, so it wasn't an issue to me. But I do really like the 4K that the EOS R can do. It's cropped, as you probably know, but the quality is really good. And for me, it's been very helpful to have something that can punch in and kind of get these highly detailed close-up shots of stuff, because I do a lot of videos about products and small things like that. So the 4K has actually been really helpful. And it looks so good that then I wanted to start making my videos in 4K. So for like a year and a half, maybe even a little more, I've been filming everything at 1080 with a little bit of cropped 4K thrown in, and then I've been upscaling it to 4K in Final Cut Pro to a 3840 by 1920 2:1 timeline. And the 1080 footage out of the EOS R is really, really good. It's super high quality 1080, so it scales up to 4K really well. It doesn't look as good as native 4K, but it looks great. But once I got better computers, like the M1s came out that could handle 4K footage no problem, once I started noticing that, yeah, there is a difference between native 4K and upscale 1080, I kind of wanted to move into a full native 4K workflow. And even though the EOS R had the best autofocus I've ever used at the time that I got it, and it is pretty good autofocus, it was starting to let me down a bit. There were just a lot of times where even talking like this, since I'm using a lens with a shallow depth of field, it would suddenly just focus on the wall behind me, and it'd be hard to get the focus back, or it would like randomly track onto something that I didn't want it to track to. So in early 2021, I decided that I was gonna upgrade my camera and get a new main camera and have the EOS R be my B camera. Are you ready to hear how that went? Because not well for Canon. Basically what I was looking for was full frame 4K with really good autofocus. My instinct, of course, was to go with Canon, so I was looking at the R5 and the R6, both of which are great cameras and the image quality out of them is fantastic, but there's a couple things about those cameras that don't work for me, namely overheating, which I know is a hot button issue that everyone gets fired up about, but it's a real thing. I live in the desert also where it gets really, really hot, and so a camera that overheats might not do very well here. I was getting tired of Canon's 30-minute record limit that for some reason they keep putting on cameras, and the R5 and the R6, despite being big full-size camera bodies, even bigger than this, they have micro HDMI ports. That was sort of it for me, because the thing with Canon is in their mirrorless bodies and even their DSLR bodies, they always prioritize photo over video. It doesn't mean their video functionality is bad, but a lot of times photo features and video features aren't super compatible. For example, having a high resolution sensor is great for photos because then you get high resolution photos. Having a high resolution sensor for video isn't always great because then you get things like overheating, rolling shutter. But with Canon, it seems like if they ever come to a point where they have to decide we need to make a compromise and either the video side or the photo side is gonna suffer, they're always gonna cripple the video side. Unless you're talking about the Cinema series cameras, but those are in a totally different price point that I'm not really gonna go into right now. And Canon did recently announce the R5C, which is a much more video-centric version of the R5, but I still don't think that it compares with the Sony cameras because it's $600 more expensive than the FX3. It doesn't have in-body image stabilization, and even though it's a Cinema series camera from Canon, it still has micro HDMI. The thing about micro HDMI for me is that it's terrible. It makes sense on something like a GoPro or a very tiny camera, but even Canon's previous DSLRs and mirrorless cameras had mini HDMI, which is at least not quite as bad. But Sony's putting full-size HDMI on most of their cameras at this point, at least their full-frame cameras. And for me, a lot of times, right now my camera is connected via HDMI so that I can monitor it, but when I'm streaming, doing calls, my camera is connected to HDMI a lot, and micro HDMI is terrible, and I didn't want to spend $4,000 on a camera that had micro HDMI. So instead of trying to make every camera a hybrid and then crippling the video side of things out of necessity, Sony, for example, with the A7 series, they have 3 models, the A7S, the A7R, and the A7. The A7S is a video camera with some photo functionality, the A7R is a photo camera with some video functionality, and the A7 is a hybrid, but it's not as good at video as the S series and it's not as good at photo as the R series. But it's better at video than the R and better at photo than the S. And that sounds confusing, but ultimately what it does for you as the customer is it lets you decide where you want to compromise. Last year when I was going through this camera search, I did a couple podcast episodes all about it where I went really, really in depth through the entire thought process. And I'll link to that in the description so that this video isn't 5 hours long. So what that meant was that I had to accept the fact that Canon might not be the best choice for me at that time. And so I thought, okay, if I'm actually gonna consider another system, because it's a total pain in the butt to switch camera systems. So I looked at everything from Sony, Blackmagic, Panasonic, Fuji, Nikon, like every major camera company. I tried to see what they had and what might work for me, and I just kind of kept landing back on Sony seems to be the one. And ultimately that led to me getting this camera right here, which is the Sony a7S III. It seemed like everybody I knew who was getting this camera for video was basically saying it was the best video camera they'd ever used. And right away I wasn't super blown away. I think I was expecting like a night and day difference, and it just wasn't there, but I think that's because there was a learning curve. So I got it in May of 2021, and over the next few months when I started using it, it seemed like every time I made something with it, it just started looking better and better. And after a few months, that's when I really started thinking, this camera's amazing. The autofocus is incredible, the image quality is great, the reliability is absurd, the quality of life features, things like full-size HDMI, no record limit. I can open the card slot door with the camera on and it doesn't turn the camera off, so I can swap out the cards. The ability to customize basically every button to whatever I want on the camera. Super good stabilization that almost eliminates the need for like a tripod or a slider. Plus 4K 120 that lets me do all these crazy like creative shots that I could have never done before. This camera gave me a lot that I just had never had before, and once I started kind of getting over that learning curve and understanding how it worked, I completely fell in love with the a7S III. And so that became my main camera for a while, and then the Canon EOS R was over here as my B camera. But shooting in 10-bit on the Sony versus 8-bit on the EOS R, as time went on, my eyes started to notice the differences more and more, to the point where I stopped liking the footage as much from the EOS R. I do really like the way that Sony handles greens and blues. As somebody who has a ton of blue stuff in the frame always, I like the way that Sony's greens and blues look, and it was just like, wow, it's like easier for me to make this image look the way that I want it to without a ton of effort. The thing that was the final straw in getting the FX3 was actually this lens right here, which is the Sirui 50mm full frame anamorphic. Sirui did like a Kickstarter campaign, and I contributed to that and then waited months for the lens to show up, and I finally got the lens, and it's amazing, and I love the anamorphic look, and I love trying to learn more about anamorphic footage. And it didn't even occur to me until after I got this lens here that I didn't even consider getting the Canon version of it. Even though I had 2 Canon cameras at the time and 1 Sony, I just immediately ordered the Sony version of the lens. And that told me like, wow, maybe mentally I'm more switched over than I realized, because it, like, buying another Canon lens was just not something I was even going to consider doing. The Sony FX3, which is this camera right here, and the a7S III, on the inside, where it counts, they're exactly the same. They have the exact same sensor, same settings, same capabilities. You can match them perfectly. They're the exact same camera. Where they're different is in the exterior. They have totally different bodies and totally different features. But the FX3 has a few things I really like, including this built-in top handle that I've talked about in a couple other videos, but it allows me to run 2 XLR inputs directly into the camera. So right now I'm using the Sennheiser MKH50 as my microphone, and it's just running straight into the camera, and the audio is perfectly synced and mixed to the video right from the recording. I don't have to record in the Rodecaster, separate audio, and then sync it. I can use all these super cool microphones directly with my camera if I want to. So having the 2 Sony cameras was amazing. And then the EOS R was my 3rd camera, and so what I was using that for, because sometimes I do use a 3-camera setup. I have my main camera, my B camera, and then a lot of times I'll have another camera kind of like getting close-up shots of stuff that I'm showing, if I'm showing anything on the desk here. This is also a better stills camera than either of these, because it is a 30 megapixel sensor versus 12. The 12 megapixel sensor on the a7S III and the FX3, that's what helps them be such good video cameras. They don't overheat, they don't need to be cropped in on anything, they have amazing low light performance, they have no rolling shutter. That's because of that 12 megapixel sensor. And while they can take really good photos, 12 megapixels isn't the best if you're planning to ever like blow up your photos or print your photos or do a bunch of crazy like compositions and stuff. So it's my 3rd camera and my stills camera, except I started feeling limited because it has that record limit. So I'd have this camera going, that camera going, they can go as long as they want, and then this camera would be over here, and I'd have to, every time I'm looking and I'm seeing, oh, it's at 27 minutes or something, okay, I need to stop everything, restart so it's all synced up again. Very frustrating. I was also getting kind of limited when I was doing photos, because if I'm going somewhere, whether it's like a work-related thing or just a personal thing, and I want to take camera to take photos, the problem with this is now I'm also kind of limited to 1080 and not 4K. But if I take one of these cameras, then I'm sort of limited in the photo capabilities that I'm able to use. Plus, these cameras are very expensive, and I get kind of nervous, especially if it's just sort of like a fun, casual thing, and I'm just like taking a camera to have photos for fun. I sort of get nervous taking these because, you know, if something happens, it would be really, really bad. So then, this happened. So this is the A7 IV. What did I get this for? Well, it kind of is the R replacement because it's full frame 4K. It can do almost everything that these two cameras can do, barring full frame 4K 60 and 4K 120, which is fine because these do that great. But it's got a 33 megapixel sensor for still photos and amazing autofocus, even slightly better than these ones, which I'm just hoping these can be updated with firmware. But especially like animal eye autofocus is completely absurd. It almost feels like cheating when you're taking photos with this because it's so easy to just get a great photo. And then I have 4K footage, and it's in basically the same body as the A7S III. There's some subtle differences, and if you think it'd be helpful, I can do individual reviews on these cameras specifically, not just about why I switched. So now I've got 4 cameras, which is super cool, honestly. I would say it's excessive, but it's really cool. This EOS R, I don't use it as much anymore because I have this, but I don't think I could ever get rid of this because it's so like sentimental to me. But I can also adapt my Canon lenses to the Sony cameras. Like I still can use all of my Canon stuff with the Sony system. Now, I'm not saying that Sony cameras are entirely perfect, but the things I dislike about them are so small compared to the things that I like. The biggest thing for me was going from a camera system where I was sort of dealing with artificial limitation and going to a camera system where it feels like there's very few limitations for video and I sort of have everything I need. I have found that I've felt more creative behind the camera since I started using these because they kind of get out of the way and just let me do whatever I want to do, and I can make all kinds of cool stuff and I have access to all kinds of cool features and capabilities. There's really only 2 things that I'm not super crazy about with the Sony, but they're not deal breakers by any means. One of them, and I think a lot of people will laugh, is battery life, which older Sony cameras, like the ones I used to use at my old job, like the A7S II and stuff, and some models around then, they had really bad battery life where you could almost just watch the battery gauge like decrease in real time. Whereas it feels like Canon, pretty much since forever, has had really good battery life. To the point where if I was going out with a Canon camera for the day and I forgot to bring a second battery, I wasn't really that worried about it. I kind of knew like, it'll probably be okay. I'll probably make it through the whole day. Even now, Sony's gotten so much better with battery life, and considering everything that these cameras do, I think the battery life's pretty darn good, but I still would get nervous going out with just one battery for a whole day. And I've had people argue with me about this, but I've used both. So like, I don't know. I think Sony's battery life used to be just so bad that by the time it got pretty good, a lot of people were like, oh my gosh, it's amazing. Whereas people who had been using Canon for a long time were like, yeah, your camera's supposed to have good battery life. That's important. But the thing that I actually dislike the most are the screens on these cameras. The EOS R, for example, came out in 2018 and costs half the price of the A7S III or the FX3. And it has a screen that's like 3 times as good. It's a 16:9 wide-angle display that's higher resolution, whereas on the Sony cameras, the screen is like this weird, I guess it's sort of 16:9, sort of 4:3. It's like kind of a weird aspect ratio, and it's okay. The colors aren't great, and the resolution's not amazing. It's like significantly lower quality than the Canon. But this is 2018, this A7 IV. I mean, it's basically a 2022 camera, and they all have kind of the same sort of like less than stellar screen. I've also found that the Canon screen is way more color accurate. It's not as big of a deal as it sounds because I'm pretty much never going to take raw footage out of the camera and just upload it or share it. So it's always going to get put into editing software and adjusted. It's always going to be run through something like Ecamm where I'm adding on, a LUT or some kind of color adjustments. So it's really not too big of a deal. Canon, when they decided to go touchscreen, they went all in on touchscreen. So if you want to change your ISO, you just tap ISO and then change it. Whereas Sony, the screen's touch responsiveness is amazing, but like not everything is touchscreen. The menu is fully touch interactive, but the settings aren't. So you're kind of bouncing back and forth between like, oh, I can touch for this, but I have to use the buttons for that. And I've gotten used to it now, but I did prefer the Canon system where it's like you could just use touch for everything if you wanted, or use the buttons if you wanted. But without dragging this video into feature-length territory, I was actually debating whether or not to even make a video about switching. I kind of thought like, I'll just use the tools that I use. If someone's asking what I'll use, I'll tell them, but I don't need to make a big deal of like, I'm using this kind of camera instead of this kind of camera. However, since I have spent so much time talking about the EOS R in the past, and I've recommended the EOS R so many times, and I know people have bought the R, the RP, even the R5, R6. They got into the whole Canon ecosystem, sometimes due in part to my recommendations. I felt like, hey, that might be kind of crappy if somebody's like, why doesn't he use the thing that he recommended anymore? And I just wanted to sort of explain that for my specific workflow, Canon just wasn't giving me exactly what I needed. Whereas it just turns out that Sony was creating cameras, or is creating cameras, that do give me exactly what I need for my workflow. You know, if you're a photo first person, not a video first person, it could be totally different. If you don't need really good autofocus because you do everything with manual lenses, I mean, that opens up all kinds of options. Like Panasonic might be the perfect choice for you. The point here isn't to say ditch your Canon and get a Sony. The point is to say, if you're looking for a new camera and you're trying to figure out what's best for you, don't feel like you're stuck with the thing that you've been using just because that's what you've been using. It's totally okay to step back, take an objective look at all the options, and then decide what's best for you. Now, my biggest test, and an area where I think Canon is really beating out Sony, is firmware updates. With the Canon R5 and the R6, they've released so many firmware updates since those cameras came out. Part of that was because they had to, because they marketed them as being these amazing video cameras, and then it turns out they were super limited upon release in some of their video functionality, and so they kind of had to make up for that. But it seems like every couple of months there's a new firmware update that adds some like legitimate functionality and some cool stuff to the R5 and the R6. As of the time that I'm recording this video, the FX3's never gotten a major firmware update. The A7 IV has not gotten one either because it's very, very new. The A7S III, which is the oldest of these cameras, old being a relative term, has only gotten one major firmware update, and that was in April of 2021. What I'm very curious about is to see how Sony continues to update their cameras over time. If they continue to update their cameras regularly like Canon is, that's gonna make it very hard to argue with them as a camera system. Stuff like, this is the least expensive Sony camera I have, and it does the Canon thing of covering the sensor with the shutter when the camera's turned off. These more expensive cameras don't do that, but there's no reason that you couldn't just put this feature in these cameras through a firmware update. Things like that, like little quality of life improvements that new camera models bring. And it's important to note that I'm also just splitting hairs here, and cameras are super fun and super amazing, and there's some really good values out there and just some awesome tools, and it's incredibly exciting. And whatever camera you have, whatever camera you get, I just hope it's something that you have a lot of creative fun with. Speaking of things that are creative and fun, thank you to everyone who helps support my channel through YouTube channel memberships and Patreon. I literally couldn't have done this without you. And if you want to see more specifically how these Sony cameras fit into my workflow, check out my studio tour video where you can see how everything works together.